Right. So warm greetings once again. Sis Priest, welcome to our second lecture session in AUI 4861 with Grad Request Consulting. So in the previous lecture that we've held, I began to introduce you to the concepts pertaining to the IPPF concept, which is the first topic in this module. And what we covered it was pertaining to some of these elements of the IPPF framework, and to be quite precise on to be quite precise on what we covered, we looked at the IIA Code of Ethics. We looked at the definition of internal auditing. We defined the mission of internal auditing, right? Then obviously we disseminated between the two broad categories of the IPPF framework, which is namely the mandatory guidance and the recommended guidance, right? So today I would like to proceed further with the mandatory guidance, but precisely with respect to the IPPF standards. And then I would also endeavor to discuss one of the past exam papers from October, November 2019. We will be looking at question 4 in that respect, right? So now, without any further ado, let me quickly take you to the IPPF standards, right? So I'm just quickly scrolling to the IPPF standards, right? So these are the IPPF standards. They are categorized into two broad categories, namely attribute standards and the performance standard, right? Now, with your attribute standards, the attribute standard deals with the characteristics of the organization and the parties performing the internal audit activities. So when you're talking about characteristics of the organization, in this context, we are referring to the audit client, right? But under normal circumstances, with us as internal auditors, we would normally be employed within the organization itself. So in this case, the organization will be referring to the employer that would have actually employed us as internal auditors within the organization in question. Then obviously the parties performing the internal audit activities here refers to the internal audit activity, right? And of course the individual internal auditors within the internal audit activity. So now attribute standards, it can be articulated as the 1000 series, and as you can see outlined, we'll be looking at standard 1000, dealing with the purpose, authority, and responsibility of the internal auditors in the organization. We'll also look at standard 1100, dealing with independency and objectivity of the internal audit function within an organization. We'll look at standard 1200, dealing with proficiency and due professional care of internal audit activity within an organization. And last but not least, with attribute standards, we'll look at standard 1300, dealing with quality assurance and the improvement program for the internal audit function, right? Then there is what we call performance standards. Performance standards, it can also be articulated as the 2000 series. These describes, or rather it deals with the nature of internal audit activities, and it also provides the quality criteria against which the performance of these services that we as internal auditors actually offer can be evaluated. Right? So in other words, it deals with the work of the internal auditors, right? Whereas with the standard attribute standards, which is 1000 series, that deal with the internal auditor as a person, right? Or as a group, which is the internal audit activity, and also deals with the organization to whom the internal auditors would be conducting those internal audit activities for. But then performance standards, we are addressing the work, describing the nature of work that we as internal auditors perform, within those organizations that will be performing for. So with standard 2000 series, we have got standard 2000 that deals with managing of the internal audit activity. Now, this one need to be a topic on its own, precisely just to take you through the outline of the topics in the module. It will be part of topic number 4, establishing administration and management of the internal audit activity. So we would refer a lot to standard 2000, right, which is managing of the internal audit activity, but we would read that together with the implementation standards as well. So it gives us more information about what the role and the responsibility of the chief audit executive is with respect to establishing administration of the internal audit function is concerned in an organization. Standard 2200 deals with the nature of the work. So our work as internal auditors, just to give you high level point of view of this, we address 3 processes, right? 3 processes of an organization, which is the governance processes, the control processes, and the risk management or risk processes, if I would call it. So these are the 3 areas of focus that we as internal auditors, add value to, in terms of our work. Now, but in two broad spectrum, which is namely consulting services and assurance services. So our consulting and assurance services, it's centralized on addressing those 3 focus areas that I've mentioned earlier, which is control processes, governance processes, and risk processes, right? We'll deal with that in standard 2100. So in 2100, you also get to see the description of what our participation, what our responsibility is when it comes to that within an organization. Standard 2200 now begins to explain what I would call the internal audit process, right? Which is, of course, starting with engagement planning. So we see activities that take place within the engagement planning phase of an internal audit process, right? Then, of course, we see standard 2300 describing how and what our specific functionalities or responsibilities are with respect to performing or carrying out of the internal audit engagement is, right? So we get to see them, for instance, the actual deployment of the internal audit procedures that we would have drafted, right? That's where we begin to, for instance, do a walkthrough test, and maybe at a warehouse section, so that we can begin to observe, or rather begin to gather sufficient and appropriate evidence which we can use to add value in that department. Standard 2400 deals with the communicating of results. Now that after we've performed their engagement from standard 2300, in standard 2400, we now begin to deal with the communication channels that are available with respect to reporting of our evidence that we have gathered in the process of conducting the audit, right? So there are different types of reports that we would have to generate, and that is part and parcel of some of the things I'll teach you when it comes to topic number 5, stakeholder communication and the audit communication. So the standard of note with respect to what you see in topic 5, it would be actually standard 2400. Right. So now after we have communicated, right, the audit results, in other words, when we've presented our working papers to interested parties, which is normally the board and management, once we've presented the working papers in standard 2400, what takes place in standard 2500 is something called monitoring progress. So when we're monitoring progress, what we are simply trying to achieve there is to evaluate if ever what we have given as recommendation to management is causing a difference, it's adding value, it's causing some form of change, positive change as it were, in addressing the risks that they might be exposed to, in addressing the weaknesses that the organization might be exposed to, depending on what they are doing, right? Very important. So that's monitoring progress. It's simply us coming back to review the progress that management has made, with respect to the recommendations for improvement that we would have given them according to the working paper report, which we would have presented to them, right? So that's standard 2500, monitoring progress. Now, lastly, standard 2600 deals with communicating the acceptance for risk. So let's say, for instance, when we have done the monitoring of progress and we discovered that, look, our management, they are willing to accept the condition that they have. Maybe in other words, we're saying they're willing to accept the risk exposure that they have, in the way they are doing things. Now, when they decide to do that, what is then our responsibility when management decide to accept to continue business as usual? Now, that's what you'll be seeing described clearly in Standard 2600, describing the responsibility that we as the internal audit activity would have with respect to a scenario where management decides to accept the risks that they are faced with, maybe in the way they are running their day-to-day activity, right? So obviously what we would have to do there, just as an overview, I mean high-level overview in this respect, would have to communicate that that decision of management to the board, so that the board is aware about what management have decided to do, based on risk acceptance. Because then remember that when it comes to risk tolerance, that is something that the board is responsible for, right? So now, if ever management decide to accept certain risk exposures that are actually beyond the scope of the risk tolerance of the organization, then, or risk appetite rather, of the organization, then they would have a problem, because now it means they are exposing themselves to dangers that may cost the organization money, that may cost the organization certain losses, wastage of company resources, and all that, right? So very important to take cognizance of that. Now, to describe some of these standards, because I know most of this we already dealt with it a bit in detail, of course, at undergrad, but I think it can be helpful to also just brush it up through, like, to revise rather, not brush it up, but to revise a bit of it from from the actual standard themselves. So I would refer you to the AUI 2601 study guide, which I'm about to present to you shortly, to describe about the IPPF standards, right? So this is the AUI 2601 study guide. And in this, I would like to take you through the IPPF standards, just so that at least you can see some bit of detail there. But I've also, summarized some of those with footnotes. So you discover as I take you through some of those standards, there are footnotes, summaries that I've presented to help you understand the standards better. Now, what is the purpose of standards themselves in general? Number one, they delineate the basic principles that present the practice of internal auditing. So in other words, it unveils, describes what internal auditing as a practice is all about. So when you look through the standards, we're able to understand what internal auditing is. We are able to understand the roles and functionalities of internal auditors with respect to the work that we do as internal auditors in practice, and how we relate to those that we offer the work or the service to, right? Very important. It also provides a framework for promoting a broad range of value-added internal auditing. So there's a standardized structure that we are able to follow based on the standards outlined. Then number three, it establishes the basis for the evaluation of internal audit performance. So even as you are, especially with performance standards, you're able to see that it outlines clearly what we call the internal audit process, for instance, from standard 2200. So we are able to know what the blueprint is as far as engagement planning is concerned. So we're able to know what the internal auditors are supposed to be doing when they are planning for an internal audit engagement. What are those planning activities that they're supposed to be conducting, during the planning phase of an internal audit engagement, right? Something like that. Then, of course, to also foster improved organizational processes and operations. So with its standards, they help us to be able to, to promote a certain way of improving the way that the organization is doing things, right? Now, I've already explained to you about this, the outline of attribute standards, performance standards, and then like I've mentioned, there's something called implementation standards. With implementation standards, they just elaborate further in detail with regards to what attribute standards are, what your performance standards are, in the sense of, or rather in the category of assurance perspective or consulting activity perspective. So you're able to understand, for instance, let me take you through the first standard 1000, so that it can make some bit of sense. So these are the footnotes that I was talking about, where I outline, where I try to unpack these standards for you in a much simplified way. So for instance, standard 1000 deals with the purpose, authority, and responsibility of the internal audit function. Now, let's try to break this thing down so that we understand what is the purpose of internal auditing. What is it that seems to reflect that there is authority that has been delegated to the internal audit function? What are the responsibilities that the internal audit function has with regards to their responsibilities, right, in the organization? Now, very important, the purpose, first of all, of internal auditors, right? Our purpose is described in the definition of internal auditing. We are there to add value. We are there to improve the way an organization is doing things. So with the purpose of internal auditing, we see the description of the type of services that we offer to the organization, which is in the broad category of consulting services, what they call consulting activities. Also in the category of what they call assurance services or assurance activities, right? Very, very important. Now, this purpose of internal auditing has to be clearly defined in what we call the internal audit charter. The same thing is true with respect to the authority of the internal audit function. The same thing is true with regards to the responsibility of the internal audit function. It all have to be clearly defined in the internal audit charter, right? Of the internal audit division in an organization. So you discover, for instance, with organizations that have an internal audit as a department or as a division, the department itself for the internal audit they ought to have what we call an internal audit charter. I'll explain what the internal audit charter is. So it's basically a formal document which defines the internal audit activities purpose, the authority, and responsibility. The internal audit charter also establishes the internal audit activities position within the organization, including the nature of the chief audit executive's functional reporting relationship that exists between the chief audit executive and the board. It also authorizes access to records, access to personnel within the organization, access to physical properties relevant to the performance of the engagement. So it doesn't necessarily mean that just because we are authorized to have access to certain physical assets, we can just, access all the assets that belong to the organization. No, it has to be pertinent to the internal audit engagement on the table at that moment, right? Very important. And also very important, it defines the scope that the internal audit activity is allowed to perform. That's where the responsibility element comes from. So to what extent are our responsibilities within the organization, right? And the scope of the internal audit division describes the type of services that will be offered within the organization, which has to be within the category of either consulting activities or assurance services. So with assurance services, we are simply referring to the internal audit assignments. That's assurance services. Whereas with consulting services, these are what we call agreed upon engagements. So it all depends on the need of management at that particular point in time, right? Very, very important. Now, so as you can see on the outline in the footnote, when it comes to ensuring that the authority of the internal audit function is established, this happens if there is an appropriate reporting channel in place. So the reporting channel, it exists in two ways. One is to be what we call administrative reporting between the CAE, Chief Audit Executive, and the Chief Executive Office. And secondly, there has to be what we call functional reporting between the Chief Audit Executive and the board, precisely the audit committee there. So you need to understand what is functional reporting. You also see it described as we proceed, but for now, I just want to ensure we address the purpose, authority, and responsibility of the internal audit function. Now, very, 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 very important. You may get questions where they may ask you to identify, okay, or where they may ask you to address the deficiency in the charter. Now, when they ask you to identify or to address the deficiencies in the charter, you need to be able to have a good background knowledge with regards to what should be contained in the internal audit charter in the first place. For you to have that, you need to then have in detail understanding of the IPPF standard, right? So, for instance, you might discover that the purpose of the internal audit activity may not be clearly defined in the internal audit charter. So if that is the case, and then you need to also give valid reasons why you're saying that it's not clearly defined, right? Okay, so that's a control. I mean, that alone is a deficiency in the charter. If the purpose of the internal audit activity is not defined, same thing is true if the authority and the responsibility of the internal audit function is not described in the charter. That alone is a deficiency, right? Why are we saying that it's a deficiency? Because it hinders the internal audit activity to perform up to standard or to perform its responsibility to the fullest as they ought to, right? So, and then the other question they will ask you, besides addressing the deficiency in the charter, they would ask you to then recommend corrective measures or do an amendment of the presented charter that has been presented to you. Now, in this case, this is where you suggest the norm, suggest the blueprint, suggest the narrative that ought to be in place. How do you do so? By giving references to the actual IPPF standard. So it's very important to have a good understanding of the IPPF standards, because it's not just in the case where they'll ask you for violations of the standard, I mean, with the IPPF, and then you have to, to then give what should have been done, which is a recommendation. But sometimes they will give you a charter, which is something like this, for instance, just so that I can show you, give you a broad perspective of how this thing can look like. It's question 3 of this past paper. Yes. Here's the question. So this is question 3. Notice the mark allocation, 38 marks. Now, let's have a look and see what they wanted. So this is a typical internal audit charter that has been given to you. But for us to understand what they wanted, we have to look at the required section and look at what they can ask. And notice this is related to the IPPF standards. So they say scrutinize the charter to what? To identify its deficiencies. With what? With reference to the IPPF. You should specify the deficiency and explain why it is a shortcoming. In other words, why it is a deficiency. Then, where appropriate, in order to address the deficiencies, recommend improvements to the charter. Refer to the relevant IIA standards to justify the recommendation. Use the table format below to answer your question. So notice there are 2 columns here. One is where you are identifying and explaining the deficiency or the shortcoming where in the charter. Remember, scrutinize the charter and identify the deficiencies. So that's what they're asking you to do. Identify the shortcomings, the deficiencies, and explaining those shortcomings or deficiencies in the charter. Do you see it now? And then on the other side, they are expecting you to give an appropriate recommendations with reference to the IAA standards where applicable. So do you see now, that's another way by which they can test you on the IPPF other than what you see in question 4. So question 4, it's a typical, typical question about the IPPF, which you are familiar with from undergrad, where they'll ask you, for instance, to column 1, to identify the IPPF requirement that has been violated, right? And then in the second column, they ask you to give the explanation of the violation. And then in the third column, they may ask you to recommend a corrective action by which the chief audit executive or the internal auditor can correct the violation in place, right? Something like that. Or what should have been done, perhaps, to have avoided the violation. So this is something common that you know from undergrad. But then what you have here, it's slightly different, but it's still testing you under the same umbrella, same concept of the IPPF standards, IPPF framework, as it were, right? But in this particular question, it was more related to the IIA standards, what they call IPPF standards, one in the same thing. Then question 3.2, they ask you to describe responsibilities of the chief audit executive in what? Managing the internal audit activity on a continuous basis for 6 marks. Now, if you look at this particular question and you look at the topic outline, remember I told you topic 4, establishment, administration, and management of the internal audit activity, IAA. So that question that you're seeing there, it's more relative to that topic number 4. I'm talking about this question 3.2. They are testing you on topic number 4 of your study material. 3.3, they ask you to provide the requirements for a quality assurance program in terms of the program, the assessments, and its reporting according to the IIA standards. All of this has to do with IPPF standards, right? So all of this I'm going to be showing you now as we go through the IPPF standards. So that's why I'm taking time to describe, to explain, to unpack the standards, because I know it's not just only limited to them asking you questions on identifying violence of the what has been violated about the IPPF, and then describing it, and then giving a recommendation. It's not only limited to that. They can ask something about the charter. So you need to be fully equipped. Right. So yeah, that was just ways of just trying to show you how this can be examined, right? But now let's continue to deal with this in detail. So the papers, the authority of the internal audit division. Okay, so here I've given a summary about that. So let me just bring it back over here, and I'm going to try and see if I can just maybe open another footnote here, right? Because I've already explained what the purpose of the internal audit activity is. Now, purpose and responsibility of the internal audit activity describes its core purpose, core existence. Why do we need an internal audit activity in the organization? Now, that description of their purpose, all right, it emanates from the definition of internal auditing as well, right? And even in their mission, the mission of the internal audit activity. But at the same time, it tallies together with the responsibility that internal auditors have, right? The responsibilities of internal auditors also describes what their duties in the organization really are, or what it entails. Now, that we begin to see obviously as we proceed further, but in any case, all of this have to be defined in the charter. We need to see why the internal audit activity as a division exists. What is the objective? What is the mission of the internal audit activity in the organization? What role do they play in as far as their existence in this organization is concerned, right? The authority of the internal audit activity is depicted if the internal audit activity have access to people, access to company records, that also involves documents, when they've got access to assets that belong to the organization, right? That's what depicts the authority of the internal audit in the organization. And also when they've got appropriate stipulations in the internal audit charter regarding this, the access, so they have to be clearly stipulated to say, look, we are allowed to have access to this and this and that within the organization in the broad spectrum of people, documents, which is records, as well as the assets that belong to the organization in question, right? So that was just to explain to you about the purpose, authority, and responsibility of the internal audit division, right? Then we proceed. So this is your implementation standards, but just describing from the assurance point of view. So the nature of assurance services provided to the organization must be defined in the internal audit charter. So it's simply trying to say that, look, so that is more related rather to the responsibility of the internal auditor. So we provide assurance and consulting activities. So any form of internal audit engagements we are going to perform, and that's what is attributed here as assurance services. It should be what? Defined in the internal audit charter. See. So if we are to provide any service in that form, for instance, if assurances are to be provided to parties outside the organization, the nature of these assurance services must be defined in the internal audit charter. So for instance, you may find cases where the internal audit division may be requested to perform a certain internal audit assurance service, but maybe it may not be contained within the internal audit charter. The question then is, what should happen? the charter may need to be amended before we accept and commence with the internal audit engagement, right? It's very important because if we agree, but yet it's not within the internal audit charter, we might be agreeing to doing something we are not authorized to do. Because, for instance, there are several other things that you need to consider. Do we have the capacity in terms of personnel that is equipped in terms of knowledge, skill, experience to conduct such services? So all of those considerations have to be looked into before we can, accept certain internal audit requests. Right? So even consulting services, the nature of consulting services should be clearly defined in the internal audit charter as well, right? So that was just to unveil to you purpose, authority, and the responsibility of the internal audit activity. Now, just to describe a little bit more and further about this document called the internal audit charter, right? Because we understand that it's one of those blueprints that defines the authority, that defines the purpose, as well as the, the purpose, authority, and responsibility, right, of the internal auditor. Now, in the charter, we do understand there's something called functional reporting that has to take place. I'm going to explain to you what functional reporting is shortly, but just while we are at that point, with the internal audit charter, this is one of the most important documents that have to be in place for the internal audit division. And that document have to be authorized or approved by the audit committee within the organization. Okay, very, very important. And it has to be reviewed almost on an annual basis. Right? Why? Because we might have certain requests management might have, which are not there in the initial charter that we might have established. So it has to be reviewed constantly. All right. Very important. Standard 1100 deals with independency and objectivity. Now, something very common and familiar here in this standard is this, attribute of objectivity. We saw objectivity as a principle in the IIA Code of Ethics as well. But now let's try to unveil it from a perspective of an IPPF standard. What is objectivity? What is independence? So when you're talking of independence, independence simply means being in a position to have freedom, or where you have freedom rather, to make decisions free from management's influence. Freedom to make decisions free from management's influence, where you've got unrestricted access to records, people, and physical assets belonging to the organization which you are auditing. Ability to give an unbiased professional judgment, meaning to say an uninfluenced professional judgment. So if you are in that state, right, where you can be free to do that, it means you are independent as an internal auditor. Now, there's something called individual independency, and there's something that we call organizational independency. Individual independence, it has to do with you as an internal auditor, singular. Then organizational independency, we are looking at the audit activity as a division, internal audit activity as a division, right? Plural. Now, what about objectivity? Same thing. There's also what we call individual objectivity as and organizational objectivity as well. But what is objectivity? Now, objectivity has to do with an attitude, an unbiased mental attitude. This is objectivity. And also being in a state where you have no conflict of interest. You do not allow any form of conflict of interest. Your primary objective is to achieve the purpose of the engagement or management's expectations. That's your primary objective and nothing else. So if you are in that, when you've got an unbiased mental attitude, it means your objective as an auditor. What about independence? Freedom. When you've got freedom to make decisions, freedom to have access to certain records, freedom to give unbiased professional judgment. So it's much to do with freedom. That's independence. Objectivity, it's an unbiased mental attitude. It has to do with your state of mind. Right. Very, very important. So that's independency and objectivity. And like I've mentioned, there's something called organizational independency, and there's also, something called organizational objectivity as well. But in any case, now when it comes to organizational independence, it can only be achieved if there's 2 reporting channels, which I've explained already, to say the chief audit executive should report administratively to the CEO and should report functionally to the board. Question now is, what does functional reporting mean? It's important. So functional reporting can be anything as enlisted here in the bullet points. It involves approval of the internal audit charter. Question is, who is approving the internal audit charter? Because yes, somebody is communicating the information to someone. Now, the person communicating the information contained in the charter, it is the chief audit executive. So he or she drafts the charter and issues it to the board for approval, precisely the audit committee in this respect. And also with functional reporting, it involves approving the risk-based internal audit plan. Every year, they have to establish an internal audit plan that they ought to follow in terms of resources that they're going to spend, in terms of the audits that they're going to be performing, right? All that. Now, approving of the internal audit budget and resource plan, receiving communications from the chief audit executive, the internal audit activities performance relative to its plan and other matters, also approving decisions regarding the appointment as well as the removal of the chief audit executive, approval of the remuneration of the chief audit executive. So in other words, who decides the salary of the chief audit executive? It's the audit committee. Who decides if ever somebody is to be appointed as the chief audit executive? It is the audit committee, the board in this perspective. It is referring to the audit committee. Who decides when a chief audit executive has to be removed? Again, it is the audit committee, part of the board, right? It also involves making appropriate inquiries, management and the chief executive officer to determine whether the chief audit executive, to determine whether the inappropriate scope or resource limitation. So if there's anything of that sort, it has to be clearly communicated through that functional reporting by the chief audit executive to the audit committee or the board in this case, right? That's organizational independence. So it can only exist if there is functional reporting taking place, right? So then of course, another important thing is that according to standard 1111, there has to be a direct interaction with the board. So who should have that direct interaction with the board? The chief audit executive must communicate and interact directly with the board. That's one of the ways of ensuring organizational independence. If the chief audit executive has no direct interaction with the board, then there is no organizational independence for the internal audit activity in that organization. Right, we're left with a minute for part A. We're going to reconnect again to deal with part B, but of the same lecture, lecture 2.
Okay, that's great.
Perfect.